Venezuela, once a beacon of promise in Latin America, a nation blessed with the world's largest oil reserves, now synonymous with collapse. How did a country hailed as a democratic success story in the mid-20th century descend into one of the most profound humanitarian crises of our time? This is the story of Venezuela's political and social unraveling, from the oil-rich optimism of the 1930s to the shattered dreams of 2025. And at its heart, it's a tale of how political failures can tear apart the fabric of a society.
Todos estos meses, todo el tiempo de marcha por mi familia, por la comida, por el pueblo.
In the 1930s, Venezuela was a nation on the cusp of transformation. Oil, discovered in abundance, turned a largely agrarian society into an economic powerhouse. By the 1940s, Venezuela was the world's second-largest oil producer, and the wealth flowed, unevenly but visibly. Cities like Caracas modernized rapidly, with skyscrapers piercing the skyline and a burgeoning middle class enjoying newfound prosperity. But beneath the surface, political instability simmered. The iron-fisted rule of dictator Juan Vicente Gómez, who controlled the country until his death in 1935, left a legacy of centralized power and suppressed dissent. When democracy briefly emerged in 1945 under Rómulo Betancourt and the Acción Democrática Party, it was a fragile experiment, overthrown by a military coup in 1948. The pendulum swung back to dictatorship under Marcos Pérez Jiménez in the 1950s, a regime marked by repression but also infrastructure growth. By 1958, Pérez Jiménez was ousted and Venezuela embraced democracy again. For a moment, it seemed the nation had found its footing. Oil revenues funded schools, hospitals, and jobs. Literacy rates soared, and Venezuela became a magnet for immigrants from Europe and Latin America. But the seeds of collapse were already planted. Reliance on oil made the economy a one-trick pony, and political power remained a prize fought over by elites. From 1958 to the late 1980s, Venezuela enjoyed a period of relative stability under a pact between two major parties, Acción Democrática and COPE. Known as the Punto Fijo Pact, it ensured power alternated between them, sidelining smaller factions and the military. For decades, this system worked. Oil boomed in the 1970s, and Venezuela nationalized its petroleum industry in 1976, promising wealth for all. By 1974, Venezuelan loan rates were held artificially low. Borrowing and spending outpaced saving. The middle class ballooned to 58% of the population, and nearly everyone enjoyed unprecedented prosperity. Yet few grasped the fragility of the economy beneath it all. The government set up a savings fund for surplus oil profits, but it turned into a slush fund for current and future leaders, never fulfilling its original intent. Public sector employment swelled to 300,000, and a law was passed that effectively barred companies from laying off workers amid rising wages. Big businesses needed hefty state subsidies just to stay afloat, while smaller firms, denied such support, went bust. Before long, just 9% of these bloated, state-backed companies accounted for 75% of all goods produced. The president took initial steps toward nationalizing the oil industry, setting a 1983 deadline. Anticipating this shift, oil companies halted investments well in advance, setting the stage for Venezuela's downward spiral in the 1980s. When oil prices not only leveled off, but plummeted by 1988, no one, neither citizens nor leaders, had prepared for the fallout. Businesses depended on government handouts, consumers relied on an inflated currency, and most jobs were unproductive, propped up by state mandates. The cash flow that fueled this facade dried up to a dribble. Yet the political system refused to cut spending, piling on massive debt instead. Under President Luis Herrera Campins, foreign debt quadrupled as he raided the oil fund and the newly nationalized PDVSA's reserves. On February 18, 1983, later dubbed Black Friday, Campins sharply devalued the bolivar. With nearly all goods imported, living costs soared overnight. To curb the frantic exodus of foreign currency, he introduced capital controls and a dual exchange rate system, 4.3 to 6 bolivars per dollar, managed by a new agency, Recati. Venezuela was hooked on global imports but could no longer settle the tab. Low oil prices lingered, inflation skyrocketed, and savings evaporated as money lost value daily. In this chaos, corruption, bribery, and black market dealings flourished. Government insiders sold dollars at favorable rates, reaping profits up to 1,000% on the black market. Price caps on food drove people to overbuy, fearing shortages. As scarcity worsened, but prices were forcibly frozen, many sold surplus goods illegally or smuggled them to nearby countries for profit. In 1989, the economy shrank by 10%. Contrary to his campaign pledges, President Carlos Andrés Pérez unleashed a harsh economic overhaul to stave off collapse. Halting debt payments, scrapping Recati, lifting price controls, hiking gas prices, and slashing social programs. The Bolívar shed 60% of its value instantly. Gas costs doubled, and violent protests broke out. Hundreds died when the military crushed the unrest. Between 1981 and 1989, poverty in Venezuela surged more than tenfold. The government's staggering corruption became undeniable. Past presidents faced charges of embezzlement, and foreign firms had reaped rewards from bribing Recati officials. In 1989, the breaking point came. President Carlos Andrés Pérez implemented IMF-backed reforms, slashing subsidies and raising prices. The response was the Caracazo, massive riots in Caracas and beyond. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, died as security forces cracked down. The social contract shattered, and trust in the government evaporated. This anger fueled public support in February 1992, when a charismatic paratrooper launched a socialist coup attempt against the elected government. Enter Hugo Chavez. A charismatic military officer, Chavez first appeared in 1992, leading a failed coup against President Carlos Andrés Pérez. Imprisoned but unbowed, he emerged as a symbol of resistance to a decaying elite. In 1998, he won the presidency on a wave of populist fervor, promising a Bolivarian revolution to uplift the poor and dismantle the old order. Chávez's policies were ambitious and polarizing. He rewrote the Constitution in 1999, extending presidential terms and centralizing power under a new Bolivarian framework inspired by Simón Bolívar. His flagship Misiones, social programs funded by oil wealth, targeted poverty head-on. Mission Robinson taught millions to read, slashing illiteracy from 10% to under 2% by 2005. Mission Barrio Adentro brought Cuban doctors to slums, building thousands of clinics. Land reform seized idle estates from wealthy owners, redistributing them to peasants. By 2011, over 6 million acres had changed hands, though often chaotically, sparking legal battles and violence. Chávez nationalized key industries beyond oil: steel, telecoms, electricity, vowing to end foreign exploitation. PDVSA, the oil giant, was purged of dissenters after a 2002 to 2003 strike, its profits redirected to social spending. In the 2000s, with oil prices soaring past $100 a barrel, these policies halved poverty from 50% to 25%, earning him fierce loyalty among the working class. When Venezuela nationalized its oil industry under Hugo Chavez in 2007, the international response was mixed. The move involved seizing control of foreign-operated oil projects in the Orinoco Belt, a major oil-producing region, and placing them under the state-owned Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA. Some countries and companies criticized the decision as a violation of property rights and a threat to foreign investment. Major oil firms like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, affected by the nationalization, sought billions in compensation through international arbitration, reflecting tensions with Western economies. The U.S., already at odds with Chávez's socialist government, condemned the action as part of a broader pattern of economic mismanagement and authoritarianism. On the other hand, some leftist governments in Latin America, like Bolivia and Cuba, praised it as a bold step toward economic sovereignty and resistance against multinational corporations. Global oil markets remained relatively stable as Venezuela continued exporting oil, but concerns grew about declining production due to state control and lack of expertise. Overall, the response highlighted ideological divides, with Chávez's allies applauding the move and his critics warning of long-term economic fallout. At first, Chávez delivered. High oil prices in the 2000s fueled misiones, social programs that built clinics, schools, and housing. Poverty dropped, and millions felt seen for the first time. But the revolution came at a cost. Chávez's reliance on oil turned PDVSA into a political tool, not a business. Production began slipping as skilled managers were replaced with loyalists. His rhetoric vilified opposition as oligarchs and imperialists, deepening division. He shuttered critical media, like RCTV in 2007, and packed courts with allies. Price controls meant to keep food affordable backfired. Shortages emerged by 2007 as producers couldn't profit. Corruption ballooned. Billions vanished into opaque funds like Fondin, later exposed by defectors as a slush fund for regime insiders. By his death in 2013, Chávez had built a cult of personality and a welfare state, but one brittle, tethered to oil, and intolerant of dissent. Chávez centralized power, undermined institutions, and vilified opposition. The economy remained tethered to oil, and corruption worsened. Chávez's death in 2013 left a polarized nation, and successor, Nicolás Maduro, ill-equipped to steer it. Under Nicolás Maduro, Venezuela's descent accelerated into a freefall. Chávez left behind a nation teetering on the edge, oil-dependent, mismanaged, and polarized. Maduro, his hand-picked successor, inherited this fragile legacy just as global oil prices began to plummet in 2014. What followed was an economic implosion that turned statistical charts into a grim storyboard of collapse. Maduro took the reins in 2013 after a razor-thin election win. He promised to carry on Chávez's socialist revolution. But instead of stability, Venezuela spiraled into chaos. Let's look at what he's done and what he's failed to do to get us here. First, what has Maduro actually done? Well, he doubled down on the policies that were already cracking under Chávez. He kept the oil industry, Venezuela's lifeline, under tight state control through PDVSA, the national oil company. But instead of investing in it, he let it rot. Production of oil plummeted. Why? Corruption and mismanagement. Billions vanished into the pockets of loyalists while rigs rusted and workers fled. Then there's the economy. Maduro clung to price controls and currency manipulation, hallmarks of Chavismo. He printed money like it was going out of style to cover deficits, triggering hyperinflation that hit an insane 1.3 million% in 2018. A cup of coffee went from a few bolivars to millions overnight. He set up the CLAP food box program to hand out subsidized goods, but it became a tool for control. Loyalists got fed, dissenters starved. Oh, and US sanctions didn't help. But let's be real, the rot started long before they tightened the screws. Politically, Maduro's gone full authoritarian. He's crushed dissent with an iron fist. Security forces like the FAS have killed thousands in poor neighborhoods. After rigging the 2018 election and stealing the 2024 vote, where Edmundo Gonzalez likely won by a landslide, he's jailed opponents, silenced the press, and leaned on allies like Russia, China, and Cuba to prop him up. Just last month, on January 10, 2025, he was sworn in for a third term amid global outcry and fresh US sanctions. His latest trick? Turning a community app into a snitch network to track protesters. So, Maduro's been busy consolidating power and running the economy into the ground. But what about the promises he made to lift Venezuelans up?
Everywhere socialism or communism produce suffering, corruption, and decay.
Donald Trump, hands off Venezuela. De inmediati. Te mira.
That's where the real failure lies. Let's talk about what Maduro hasn't done. He's failed to diversify the economy. Venezuela is still a one-trick pony. Oil accounts for over 90% of exports. When prices tanked in 2014, there was no plan B. Industries Chávez nationalized, like steel and electricity, are shells of themselves. Small businesses, crushed by regulations and shortages. By 1989, Venezuela learned oil booms don't last. Maduro ignored that lesson entirely. Infrastructure? A disaster. Power outages are routine, sometimes nationwide, because he didn't maintain the grid. Hospitals lack basics like bandages and medicine. Infant mortality spiked 30% in 2016 alone. 7 million Venezuelans need aid, and over 8 million have fled since 2014, one of the biggest migration crises ever. Maduro blames sanctions, but the exodus started years before they hit hard. And then there's corruption. Maduro's failed to stop, or even slow, the looting of Venezuela's wealth. His inner circle, dubbed the Boliburguesia, lives large while kids starve. The CLAP program, a cash cow for loyalists, gold from the Orinoco mining arc, pocketed by military cronies. Transparency International ranks Venezuela in the top 5% globally for corruption. Chavez wanted equality. Maduro delivered a kleptocracy. He's also failed democracy. Free elections? Gone. The opposition's been gutted. Maria Corina Machado's in hiding. Edmundo Gonzalez is exiled in Spain. Maduro promised a socialist utopia. Instead, he's given Venezuelans repression, hunger, and despair. Oil, the lifeblood of Venezuela's economy. In 2013, Venezuela produced about 2.5 million barrels per day, according to OPEC figures. By 2020, mismanagement, underinvestment, and corruption at PDVSA, the state oil company, had slashed that to a mere 337,000 barrels per day, a drop of over 85%. The 2014 oil price crash, from over $100 a barrel to below $40, stripped away revenue that once masked these failures. Production didn't just decline, it collapsed. This price crash caused the economy to implode. Hyperinflation hit, reaching over 1,000,000% by 2018. The believer became worthless, and families couldn't buy food or medicine. The social fallout was catastrophic. Oil production fell from 1.5 million barrels daily in 2018 to under 600,000 by 2021 after U.S. sanctions tightened. By 2025, output has crept back to around 850,000 barrels per day, but it's a shadow of its former self, a loss of nearly 2 million barrels daily since Chavez's peak years. Take the story of the Morales family from Maracaibo. In 2019, Jose Morales, a mechanic, and his wife Ana, a school teacher, made a decision that millions of Venezuelans faced. With 2 young children, Sofia, 8, and Luis, 5, they could no longer survive on salaries that bought less than a loaf of bread a month. Jose had watched his repair shop dwindle as spare parts vanished from the market. Ana's school shut down half its classrooms due to teacher shortages and lack of electricity. The breaking point came when Sofia fell ill with a fever, and the local pharmacy had no medicine, not even aspirin. After selling their furniture for a fraction of its worth, the Morales family joined a caravan of migrants walking toward Colombia. Ana later recalled, "We left behind our home, our memories, everything, because staying meant watching our children starve." By 2025, they were among the 8 million who'd fled. A statistic, yes, but also a family torn from its roots by political failure. By 2020, over 90% of Venezuelans lived in poverty. Malnutrition stalked the young and old. UNICEF reported stunting in 1/3 of children under 5. Hospitals, once a point of pride, stood empty, lacking supplies and power. The middle class vanished, and crime soared as desperation took hold. Gangs and military loyalists filled the vacuum of a crumbling state. Amid this chaos, a new figure emerged: Juan Guaidó. In January 2019, the 35-year-old opposition leader, head of the National Assembly, declared himself interim president, citing Maduro's fraudulent 2018 re-election, where turnout was a dismal 46% and opponents were barred or jailed. Backed by the US, EU, and over 50 nations, Guaidó rallied massive crowds, promising to oust Maduro and restore democracy. His boldest move came April 30th, 2019, when he called for a military uprising alongside defecting soldiers. For a fleeting moment, it seemed possible. Tanks rolled into Caracas and clashes erupted. But the military brass stayed loyal to Maduro, bolstered by oil profits and fear of prosecution. Guaido's momentum faded. By 2020, infighting among opposition factions and U.S. sanctions fatigue weakened his coalition. Maduro outmaneuvered him with arrests, propaganda, and handouts to loyalists. By 2025, Guaido's campaign is a memory, his exile in Colombia a symbol of dashed hopes, leaving Venezuelans to question if change is possible without unity or force. Politically, Maduro clung to power through rigged elections, like the 2018 vote, widely rejected internationally, and brutal repression. Protests in 2014, 2017, and beyond left hundreds dead and thousands jailed. U.S. sanctions aimed at toppling him instead deepened the crisis, cutting oil revenue further. Opposition leader Juan Guaido's 2019 bid to unseat Maduro fizzled, leaving Venezuelans hopeless. The exodus became biblical. By 2025, over 8 million, more than a quarter of the population, had fled to Colombia, Brazil, and beyond. Families split apart, and once vibrant communities turned to ghost towns. Those who stayed faced a daily gauntlet of hunger, blackouts, and fear. Let's zoom in on the social cost of these political failures. From 1990, when the Caracazo exposed the elite's disconnect, to 2025, Venezuela's collapse wasn't just economic, it was human. Education, once a ladder to progress, crumbled. By 2020, half of school-age children weren't attending classes. Some worked to feed families, others lacked transport or food to sustain a day's learning. Education's decline tells a story of lost futures. In the 1970s, Venezuela boasted an 85% literacy rate and a growing university system, fueled by oil wealth. By 2017, UNESCO reported school attendance had dropped to 58%, a 30-point plunge in 2 decades. Teachers paid as little as $5 a month by 2019, abandoned classrooms for survival jobs. Take Maria Gonzalez, a 15-year veteran teacher in Valencia. In 2020, she quit after her school lost power for weeks and parents stopped sending kids. Many scavenged for scraps instead. I taught multiplication with chalk on a wall because we had no books, she said in a 2021 interview from Bogota, where she'd fled. By 2023, the World Bank estimated 3 million children were out of school, a generation robbed of learning as schools became husks, lacking desks, roofs, or hope. In 2025, some rural areas report 80% dropout rates, with kids as young as 10 joining the informal economy or gangs. Consider Dr. Elena Ramirez, a pediatrician at Caracas University Hospital. In 2016, she was still hopeful, working grueling shifts despite dwindling resources. But by 2018, the hospital was a shell. Blackouts left incubators dead, and surgery relied on phone flashlights. Elena once found herself unable to save a 3-year-old boy with pneumonia because antibiotics hadn't been delivered in months. "I trained to heal, not to watch children die," she said, her voice breaking in a later interview. In 2019, after armed looters raided the hospital's last supplies, she abandoned her post and fled to Spain. Her departure wasn't just a personal loss, it was a blow to a healthcare system that had once boasted some of Latin America's best doctors. By 2025, Venezuela's medical brain drain had left behind skeleton crews of underpaid, overstretched staff, a direct consequence of a government that prioritized loyalty over competence. The elderly promised dignity under socialism were abandoned. Pensions worthless, healthcare non-existent. Consider Rafael Torres, a 78-year-old retiree from Puerto La Cruz. In the 1970s, Rafael worked 30 years at an oil refinery, part of Venezuela's golden era, retiring in 2000 with a modest pension and pride in his contribution. Under Chavez, his pension held, barely, thanks to oil-fueled subsidies. But by 2016, under Maduro, hyperinflation rendered it useless. What once bought a month's groceries covered a single egg. By 2020, Rafael's pension was $2 monthly, while a kilo of rice cost $3. His wife, Carmen, died that year after a stroke. No medicine or hospital beds were available. Alone, Rafael scavenged trash for food, a sight captured in a 2022 viral video showing him weeping as he clutched a rotten mango. "I built this country," he said, voice trembling. And now it spits me out. By 2025, 80% of pensioners live below the poverty line, per the Venezuelan NGO Convite, scavenging or begging, a generation discarded by a regime that once vowed to protect them. Youth, meanwhile, turned to crime or migration. The murder rate, already high in the 1990s, spiked under Maduro, peaking at 81.4 per 100,000 in 2016, per the Venezuelan Observatory of Violence, making Caracas deadlier than war zones like Baghdad. By 2025, it's eased to 45 per 100,000. But violence remains woven into daily life. Gangs like the Tren de Aragua filled power vacuums, extorting families and running drugs across borders. Consider Javier, a 19-year-old from Petare, a sprawling Caracas slum.
Está cada día peor, mi querido. Si este hombre no se va, aquí Venezuela, bueno, ya. Una guerra. Una guerra aquí. Aquí lo que hay es guerra. Una guerra.
In 2018, with no job prospects and a brother killed in a robbery, he joined a gang. It was eat or be eaten, he told a journalist in 2020, before disappearing, likely dead or deeper underground. Police, underfunded and corrupt, often colluded with criminals. The UN reported 8,000 extrajudicial killings by security forces from 2015 to 2020, targeting suspected gang members and protesters alike. Crime didn't just rise, it reshaped society, turning neighbors into threats and streets into battlegrounds. Trust eroded, not just in leaders, but in neighbors, as survival trumped solidarity. Families bore the deepest scars. Parents watched children waste away or leave, never to return. The diaspora stretched across continents, a generation lost to a nation that couldn't hold them. By 2025, Venezuela's social fabric, woven through decades of oil-fueled hope, was threadbare, replaced by despair and resilience in equal measure. Venezuela's story is a warning. From the 1930s to 2025, it's a tale of squandered potential, of how political greed, short-sightedness, and authoritarianism can unravel a society. The oil that built the nation couldn't save it when leaders failed to diversify, to govern fairly, to listen. Today, as of February 2025, Venezuela limps on, its people enduring, its future uncertain. Venezuela's at a tipping point. Maduro's entrenched, backed by the military and foreign allies. The opposition's fighting. Thousands protested his January inauguration. But they're outgunned. The economy's limping along. Inflation's down from its peak, but poverty's still at 50%. U.S. bounties on Maduro's head, now $25 million, haven't budged him. Meanwhile, the world watches as Venezuela bleeds talent and hope. Maduro's failures aren't just numbers, they're lives. A nation that could have been a powerhouse is now a warning. What's next? Some say civil war looms. Others see a slow chokehold like Nicaragua's. One thing's clear. As long as Maduro clings to power, Venezuela's nightmare continues. But amidst the ashes, Venezuelans persist. Their resilience whispers a fragile hope that one day the collapse might give way to renewal. For now, though, the world watches and history judges. What do you think? Can Venezuela recover, or is this the endgame? Drop your thoughts below, hit that like button, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's biggest stories. Until next time, stay curious and take care.